And we're going to be thinking about preparing for later life, both from an individual perspective about what we need to do, the perspective of employers, and also thinking about some of the policy implications. And we've got a great panel who I will be introducing to you in a moment.
As part of the research, basically I did a risk assessment on men and women's lives, and I identified that there are 12 key financial risks facing women, and I think many of these are faced by men through the life course. And I called these perils and pitfalls. And what I was able to see in these perils and pitfalls is a number of patterns around how they accumulate into a later life resilience and a pension deficit, in particular for women, which then leads to a longevity trap in later life. If I can move on and share with you what that means for the over 50s. There are a number of trends that are emerging. So what we see, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is that we're all sort of working longer, working more. And actually we see also some pretty significant gaps in the 50s between men and women in relation to pensions. At the same time, what we see is that people are having babies later, many women having babies in their 40s, and that means we're caring more into our 50s, both for children and for adults. And this really is leading to some significant issues around resilience, but also we're not necessarily at that point, although we're caring, we're not necessarily thinking about actually being cared for ourselves.
Our programme, Supporting Our Older Workforce, thinking of something that Jane said earlier, it's a little bit different in the NHS, that we are dealing with and supporting people who actually do have pensions. And they absolutely realise that they are in a very lucky position, a lot of them. I mean, not lucky, but obviously they've worked all their lives for this, so, you know, it is deserving, but they are in a position, a much better position than a lot of people in our country who are going to find themselves at the age of 60 plus with no other pension than waiting till 66, 67 for their state pension. So, you know, there's a lot of difficulty there. So people in the NHS do realise that they are in that position. What we're really focusing on in the workshops is that there is a dual responsibility here, a dual responsibility in terms of the individual looking after their own well-being and thinking about later life, but also a responsibility for the organisation, so that the organisation has a responsibility to its members of staff to make sure that as they get older, they are well cared for in the organisation. So that's the dual focus of the workshops, really. As it says, it's really needed because both men and women in their 50s and 60s are often still working, as well as supporting elderly parents and helping to care for grandchildren. So what we're finding with practically all of the participants on the workshops is they're being pulled in the middle. There's a real, organisational gain to keeping older people, older workers in the workplace and keeping them effective and supported to do that.
So who feels fully prepared for their later life? Show of hands. Look at the sea of hands. 2 people. Great. 3, 4. Brilliant. So not that many people. I don't either, to be honest. So there's a lot to do. Retirement is actually quite a difficult stage of life for some people. They're not particularly prepared for it. People can be very worried about losing their meaning and purpose, as well as the social life that work can often bring, the intellectual stimulation, in some jobs, physical activity, in some other jobs. So we know that in middle age, people should be planning potentially to work for longer. So as well as financial security, people talk about wanting to have good health. That's really fundamental. That's kind of underpinning pretty much to all the other areas. And everybody knows that preparing for later life means, in terms of health, means eating healthily, being at a good weight, drinking less alcohol, not smoking, doing more physical activity, taking measures to protect your mental health. And in middle age, all these things become way more important. Now, one kind of drag on planning, which has got the potential to impact on all of these areas, is ageism. And as a society and as individuals, I don't think we realise quite how pervasive it is and quite how pernicious it could be.
So I think in particular, Jane really showed how this is a lifelong issue. So we're talking about preparing, thinking about this in midlife, and you targeted your courses at 50, and Louise has similarly been talking about midlife. But rather than just focusing on preparing for later life, the question is, do you think we should be planning much earlier, perhaps even starting in schools?
And it's the conversations that we have at home and in society. And I guess my learnings through this whole programme is we just don't talk about money in our society. We don't talk about money, and we don't talk about pensions.
This is the other thing I think about living standards. Do we need to have there's obviously a lot of debate going on about whether the living standards of generations are going to keep up with those of previous generations. What do we, with the 100-year life, talk about this, a longer working life. How do we need to change people's expectations?
I mean, one of the messages is that it's never too late, isn't it? So actually, at whatever stage you become aware of changes you need to make, then you should do that. But I think particularly on pension savings, I think Jane's absolutely right. That does need, particularly for women, as you clearly laid out, that does need to start much earlier. And as the housing market has changed, and a significant amount of the wealth and is locked up in land and housing that a larger number of old people have, then certainly, the Resolution Foundation and others would say that that has caused intergenerational unfairness. I mean, what we would say is that there is a significant amount of inequality within generations as well. So there are a lot of poorer older people.
Does caring come up on your courses? Is that an issue for people?
All the time, really.
Yeah.
It is a huge issue. I would say at least 80% of the participants on the workshops are caring in some respect for other people outside the workplace. And just to say also about, the concept of ageism, ageing isn't being old. Ageing is from birth. We're getting older from birth. So I feel really strongly that what we don't want to see in ageism is that we're pitting the young against the old, that it goes across the board. Therefore, as Jane said, we do want to start early and get it into our culture that we're thinking about this.
We are calling for all employers to have a carers policy by law.
Okay, so quite a range of issues there. The experience of ageing without children, how we deal with the menopause in the workplace, how we support people to retrain and re-enter, and then something about the cultural sphere.
So the workshop that Gloria's developed is looking at managers, how can you support your own health, but also support the health of your staff?
The media is, on the whole, quite ageist. I think the print media more, but certainly broadcast media, both in employment of staff as well as on screen, is pretty ageist, and particularly when you get to the kind of intersectional points. So if you're an older woman or if you're an older black woman, then you're so unlikely to feature proportionately on screen.
We're working jointly with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Department of Work and Pensions to see if we can develop and test a new approach to employment support that recognises that something different is often needed. We've been thinking about all aspects of preparing and planning, but if there was one thing you could change that would better support people to plan for their later life, what would it be? So one thing that you would change that would support people to plan better for later life. I'll start with Jane.
Well, I'd have to say engaging in one's financial life and talking about money and pensions.
Louise?
Do more about your health in middle age, because that's going to really determine what your later life is like in lots of ways.
Gloria?
Just recognise that there's a dual responsibility of individual and the organisation, and to flag that up early on.
Okay.
I would say we have to think about working longer and living our lives to the full.